Okay, well, welcome everybody. Let's just swap present view. There we go. Welcome to today's webinar. It is great to see so many people here today. My name is Werner de Wit, and I'm the operations coordinator of the UNESCO Chair on Intercultural Competence. You're welcome to introduce yourself in chat. It is quite interactive. The chat will stay available for everybody. So just want to let you know that we are recording this today. So if you do not wish to be seen on the recording, you're welcome to keep your um, picture off. And if you have any questions throughout the webinar, you can put it in chat. So you're welcome to put it in chat as we go. At the end, we'll give the speaker a chance to answer those questions, and there'll also be an opportunity for you to raise your hand and to ask questions. There will also be an additional opportunity, as usual, with our World Council and a working group for ICC in Africa next week to continue the discussion and ask further questions, which will be next week, Wednesday at 3 o'clock. So, but we will post the details about that, and I'll also be emailing you about that, and we'll take a group photo later. So just quickly, we are at Stellenbosch University, and the UNESCO Chair on Intercultural Competence is housed here at Stellenbosch University. Our team is Dr. Darla Deerdorf as the chairholder, and we have our two co-chairs who are in the room today, Dr. Precious Simba and Dr. Davinia Jitu. And then we've got myself as the operations coordinator, and then we've got three team leads. Our chair looks at the intersection of intercultural competence with peace building, climate action, and gender equity. And Rabia Abba Omar, Yensiwe Mbisa, and Sarah Richmond are our team leads for those different streams. We also use UNESCO Story Circles as a capacity building initiative and tool that many of you might know about, which is really a great tool to be able to develop your own intercultural competence in yourself and that of participants. So it's an open access manual available freely online. So please go and look at that. If you do not know about it, it will be great for you to explore that and to also contact us if you would like to know more about that. Then just an invitation for you. One of our partners is the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. And the website is that it's a free platform to join. And there are many, many, many working groups on this World Council platform, which you can join. And there's really something for everyone. One specific one that we are also involved in, that I, as well as one of our co-chairs that's in the room, facilitates, is the ICC in Africa working group. You're also welcome to join that. There are more than 5,000 colleagues connected to the World Council. It's free to join, and it's really a platform to connect and to engage. And usually 1 week after this webinar, we have our monthly get together, and then we use that as a debrief of the webinar, and also a very discussion space where you are welcome to ask questions. We invite the speaker to come back if they are available, and it's really a free-flowing opportunity to discuss. So you're welcome to join that. Then just some upcoming events. Oh, not on the 22nd of May. I see I didn't change that. On the 25th of July, I'll post it in chat, is our next webinar featuring Dr. George Mutuawan. And it will be on intercultural competence for peace building in Africa, road to global peace. So I will post in chat the link for that. So you're welcome to also register for our next webinar. Just a note there again, it's on July. It's in July. And then we've got our UNESCO Chair on Intercultural Conference happening in Rabat, Morocco, from the 29th of September to the 2nd of October. The call for proposals was open and is now closed, but the registrations are now open. So you're welcome to start registering for the conference. We are slightly delayed with the conference program, but it should be all up and ready by the end of this week. So by Monday, you'll be able to see the conference program and register, but we will also send all of you a reminder. So without further ado, I'll hand over to one of our co-tech, Dr. Davinia Jittu, to introduce today's speaker. Thank you, Davinia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Varna. Colleagues, thank you for joining our webinar today as part of our UNESCO Chair on Intercultural Competencies webinar series. Today, Janet Jobson will be speaking to you about nurturing hope in challenging times, how we build courageous leadership for humanity. Janet presently serves as the CEO of the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, embracing the role as a profound opportunity to advance justice, reconciliation, and repair, both in South Africa and globally. Central to her mission is the power of storytelling, deep listening, and bearing witness to one another's experiences. Inspired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu's exceptional ability to confront injustice and inequality with a deep commitment to shared humanity, Janet and the foundation strive to continue his legacy through their work. She is a former deputy CEO of the DGMT Trust and a Rhodes Mandela Scholar. So Janet, we are truly honored to have you present this webinar, and I'd love to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Davinia and Varna. I'm feeling incredibly jealous of all of the notes in the chat of people who are in summer at the moment. Cape Town has particularly bad weather this week, so I'm hoping to import some of your warmth through the screen as we chat today. Let me just quickly share my slides. As Varna said, we are... Sorry, I am not finding what I need. Give me 1 second. There we go. So at the Desmond Tutu Legacy Foundation, we're incredibly privileged to work with the legacy of one of the world's probably most exceptional leaders. And in particular, what strikes me about Desmond Tutu's leadership was the universality of his understanding of our shared humanity and our human rights. One of the big challenges we have as a foundation is that if you can think of any issue, Desmond Tutu spoke up on it. And so in being a legacy foundation, the expectation is that we work on every issue of injustice that there is, which he managed to do, but is not necessarily within our realm of possibility. But that sort of breadth of issues that he cared about and that he spoke up on led to us really trying to think about almost the meta work of legacy. What were the broad themes we could take out of his legacy that could then apply to a range of different issues? And what are the principles that underpin that? When I sent in the title of this presentation, I didn't have a question mark at the end. How can we grow courageous leadership for humanity? But in the last the last few years, the last few weeks, we seem to be in even more challenging times. There seems to be even more urgency to find courage and to find a leadership that really is for the good of all human beings and the planet. So this presentation is really a meditation, a few thoughts that are swirling in my mind about the question of hope, about the question of courage, and about the question of the times we're living in. As much as we are on the brink of sort of climate catastrophe and sort of a deepening global conflict, it's interesting today just to note 2 anniversaries that may hold some meaning. If you're South African, today is the 70th anniversary of the formation of our Freedom Charter in 1955, where 3,000 people came together to set an ambitious vision for a multiracial non-discriminatory South Africa, which took many, many more years to achieve. But the Freedom Charter really underpinned ultimately what became our constitution, and remains an incredibly important and powerful document guiding us as a nation. And then it's also the 80th anniversary of the UN Charter being established, a site where we hope the best of humanity can find each other. Although we, as we say, challenging times at present. I really think hope is at the center of Desmond Tutu's leadership. He really embodied for us a sense that hope is not passive, it's not airy-fairy, it's not light, that it's gritty and it's real, and it is deeply linked to the ability to believe that the storms will pass. I hold it's been quite a useful mirror to me to say, well, despair and cynicism actually are easier than hope. It's easier to give up. It's easier to believe that it's not going to get better. And I think I'm not an academic, but I imagine many of you are, that sometimes cynicism rules the day in intellectual circles. It's the more, it's the view that seems less naive, is the cynical view. But hope really is something astonishing, because it positions us fundamentally in relationship with action and in relationship with the future. And it isn't easy work. It's heartbreaking work to believe and to have hope. But there's something so powerful in the fact that you're risking the audacity of hope, as Obama would have said. We at the foundation really think about hope as being part of the process of how we fuel what we call the courage to heal, which is what we think Desmond Tutu's larger legacy speaks to. How do we grow society's courage to heal? And we really think of that courage, that healing, as asking three types of work from us. The work of reconciliation, which we think of as the very hard work of keeping on trying to find each other, particularly to find each other across divides. There's an interesting book about South Africa called Nation on the Couch by a professor at the University of Cape Town called Wabi Long, where he diagnoses, he's a psychotherapist, a professor of psychology, and he sort of diagnoses our nation's psyche. And he comes to the conclusion that perhaps what best characterizes South Africa is a sense of alienation. Not alienation as in we have no relationship with each other, but alienation as in our relationships are defined by relationlessness. Tricky to get that mouthful out. But what does it mean if we live together in a society, but we are defined in our relationships by relationlessness? It means we have to find an antidote to relationlessness, and that is to come into relationship with each other, into building a relational world between ourselves. And so the work of reconciliation is not an end point, but rather a journey of becoming more human to each other. It's an incredibly challenging ask, particularly in situations of deep disagreement, in situations of oppression and discrimination. But there is something very powerful about committing to the process of keeping on trying that allows us to walk through even the darkest parts of the process. But reconciliation alone is quite anemic. It must be combined with the work of repair. And in one sense, Archbishop Tutu's legacy of repair was the profound work that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did on setting an agenda for reparations in South Africa. That included, in the South African context, the creation of a wealth tax to try and build a more equal society. One of the tragedies of the post-Truth and Reconciliation Commission period in South Africa was that almost all of the recommendations made by the TRC were not taken up by government. or were only partially taken up by government. And so reparations remain a key aspect of the agenda of victims of gross human rights violations in South Africa. But repair is bigger than reparations, certainly bigger than just financial or symbolic reparations. It must be about tackling the injustice and inequality. It must be about really taking on all of the injustices that define our societies and that define the conflicts and the exploitations that we see. Reconciliation and repair themselves leave us back in some sort of stasis. And so for us, what we've found really powerful is to then bring into the conversation the work of reimagining, how we explore who and how we can be together. A lot of this way of thinking is inspired by an extraordinary moment. In 1989, Desmond Tutu led a march of about 30,000 people in the streets of Cape Town. And it was a multiracial, multi-faith, multi-sectoral march, really, truly diverse. And it was at this march that he said to the crowd, "We are the rainbow people of a new nation." And that idea became what then was termed the Rainbow Nation. And if you ask any South African now, we would probably hold quite a lot of cynicism about the idea of the Rainbow Nation. But at the time, at the height of the logic of separation, of division, the idea that we could be together, that we could have a way of being that was fundamentally different, was actually quite radical. And it was a theme throughout Tutu's activism. He in the 70s, there's a wonderful speech he gave where he says, I keep imploring white people, join us, join the winning side. He had a certainty about what the world could look like, where we could be different in how we are with each other. So we use this way of thinking of how we bring together reconciliation, repair, and reimagination in all of our work. But to go on these journeys of healing requires immense courage. And courage, in my understanding and experience, is really fueled by the interplay between hope and action. I was thinking, if you think of hope as the oxygen of the fire of action, it really is what allows us to believe that change is possible, even when we can't see the path of the way forward. But if it's just hope alone, then it will easily flicker out. Hope must fuel action, and then action sustains hope. And this interplay really generates an extraordinary sense of courage. I think momentum is an undervalued aspect of how change happens. And often we think about, even in our work in reimagining, we can think about sort of grand ideas of the future or grand hopes for our society. But there's interesting work. My previous life was in youth development, and there's interesting work in youth development about what they would technically call sort of the time discounting of risk. But basically, if you ask a young person what the future looks like, most of them, no matter what their circumstances, will say it looks bright. Although this might be out of date in the current context of a climate catastrophe, where there is growing anxiety amongst young people. But in a context like South Africa, if you asked your average young person what tomorrow looks like or what next month looks like, they're pretty pessimistic. They don't have a sense that there's real and imminent change that's going to happen in their lives. So even while they may imagine a future, when we ask this typical question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And everyone can come up with this beautiful answer. There's a huge gap between where young people are now and where they hope to be, where they aim to be in the distant future. I think there's a fascinating book, now very out of date, but sort of came out in 2011, called Growing Up in the New South Africa, by Rachel Bray and Jeremy Seekings and others. And they essentially did a deep dive into 3 communities in Cape Town. A white community, Fishhook, a so-called colored community in the South African racial terminology, Ocean's View, and a black community, Masiphumelele. And they explored the lives of young people in these 3 very different contexts that live literally next to each other in the city. And one of the graphs that struck me most reading that book was that they asked adolescents and their parents whether they thought they would go to university. And most of the white children and most of the white parents believed their children would go to university. Most of the black children, most of the black parents thought their children would go to university. And a slightly lower proportion of children and parents in the Ocean's View community. But if you then compare that to the reality of what happened, well, most of the white children that thought they were going to go to university did end up going to university. But there's this massive gap between the aspirations of access to university and the reality of what played out for the black children in this study. And that gap of aspiration, I mean, it is an astonishingly beautiful thing that we have such a powerful aspiration for education and for building this better life. But unless we can build the actions in between, unless we can build the real stepping stones towards ultimately a shift in someone's life circumstances, we're going to be stuck in a situation of hope without action. And we're going to lose the ability to continue fueling the courage that's needed to really draw new ways of being and new ways of shifting patterns of exclusion and inequality in society. I love this quote from Desmond Tutu that he says, "The tidal wave of change is made up of 1,000,000 ripples. Do what you can where you can, because it may just be that your act of courage encourages someone else. And that person says, hey, he's done that. Maybe I can." And it builds up and it builds up. And I think of the momentum of 1,000,000 ripples and the relief it gives me as someone trying to have an impactful life, that I don't need to be the tidal wave, but that I do need to engage in ensuring that I am creating ripples that move in the momentum with others, that really build upon each other, and that start to make a coherent, larger wave of change that might happen. One of the emerging ripples I've seen in sort of the last couple of years is a profound new engagement with the idea of our inner selves being fundamental to change that happens on the outside. There's that wonderful quote by Bill O'Brien that the quality of the intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener. And I've really seen in a wide range of contexts that people are beginning to really explore this concept of the inner work we need to do. You may know about the inner development goals, for instance, a set of qualities of being that are needed in order for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and really work being done on thinking about how we generate the inner development goals to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. There's some fascinating work, for instance, by Christiana Figueres, who was the UN climate chief, and she's created an organization called Global Optimist, where they are bringing together Buddhist monks and climate change experts and facilitating retreats for people to, I mean, the phrase is the way out is in, really to do deep personal work as part of building communities that can ultimately do extraordinary technical work, extraordinary political work. But interesting that the inner world is becoming more and more prevalent. I recently attended a conference on systemic risk, which is sort of the risk of climate catastrophe, systems collapse, economic collapse, global conflict. And the attendees were largely people with very technical backgrounds, so insurance people, military risk assessors, humanitarian organizations who respond to catastrophe. And the framing of the conference up front had been quite technical, all of the documents that were sent out. But they kicked off the conference with a keynote by Ben Okri, the incredible poet and novelist. And it was so powerful because what lasted then through all of the technical conversations over the next 2 days were 2 words, hope and love. And to hear people in technical spaces use love and invoke hope, I think really gives me a lot of hope, I guess, that there is something generative happening in understanding that our humanity must be amplified, that it is our humanity, that is our being with each other that is so fundamental. In our work at the foundation, we sort of do this work through what we call the work of self-repair for societal repair. So taking the ideas of reconciliation, repair, and reimagination into practice, particularly with young professionals, to build this leadership for humanity by connecting the work of our woundedness as human beings to the work of our woundedness as societies, and the work of working with that woundedness, drawing in both directions. It's meant that in our design of programs, we spend a lot of time thinking about what grounding and presencing practices are, how we can be more human, more bound by our shared humanity in the room, in the moment in which we're exploring. It's meant that we center Ubuntu, which most of you probably have heard of, which is this idea that our humanity is fundamentally tied up with each other. The saying in South Africa is a person through other people. But it's got a profound implication. If my life is fundamentally defined by being tied up with the lives of every single other human being, whatever their circumstances, whatever their beliefs, then it requires of me an expansive humanity. It requires of me a way of living into connection that is challenging, but incredibly powerful. I think there's enormous work on deepening compassion. My experience, particularly with activists, is that they're hard on themselves. And I think we can be hard on the fact that it feels so hard to make change happen. But self-flagellation and I think about this. I worked for many, many years on early childhood development as part of the DG Murray Trust. And for many, many years, it didn't seem like anything would change. And suddenly, in the last 2 or 3 years in South Africa, we've had a massive societal commitment to early childhood development. That is, on the one hand, it's sudden. On the other hand, it's decades of people working at the issue. It's decades of people really framing the importance of young children, doing the technical work, building the agency of the sector to speak for itself and to own its own destiny. One of the most challenging aspects of the programs we run is the work of grappling with forgiveness. Many people that critique the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and in particular critique Desmond Tutu, critique him for what is perceived as creating an expectation that victims forgive. And this can create this sort of expectation, came to sort of be known in some way to create the idea that there were good victims and there were bad victims. And the good victims were these noble individuals who could overcome the suffering and forgive. And the bad victims were those who were not ready to forgive or did not want to or rejected the idea entirely of forgiveness. I have a more nuanced view on Tutu's perspective, which is that on the one hand, we must understand him alongside his incredible work as an activist for humanity as a religious figure, and that forgiveness was fundamentally rooted in his theological perspective on the world. But if you actually go back to the TRC and you go back to these moments where he's reflecting on the process, he sounds truly astonished that anyone forgave. He doesn't take it for granted. He sees it as an opportunity for liberation, but I think we're reading too much into it if we believe he expected forgiveness, and I'll come to that more in a moment. And then really building our ability to play, to create, to reimagine, to hold joy and laughter, and the song and the dance as part of the process of both repair for ourselves, but repair for our societies. And I think so often Indigenous communities demonstrate these non-intellectual, in terms of not head, processes of reimagining, but processes of the hands and the heart, of really bringing us into a new way of being with each other. These are sort of the themes that we work with in our Leading for Humanity model, but it does sort of lead me to thinking about what we're really asking of people when we try to build courageous leadership. And the first thing that comes to me is that courageous leadership really asks us to engage in acts of seeing and hearing into spaces of discomfort. Desmond Tutu and his daughter Mpho wrote a book called The Book of Forgiving, in which they sort of laid out this fourfold path. You've got the cycle of harm and violence and pain, which can be perpetuated and continued. Or there's this moment of choice where you can choose healing. You won't necessarily heal, but you can choose that process. And fundamental to that process are these two first steps of telling the story and naming the hurt. And naming the hurt in particular is a profoundly important experience. And bearing witness to people's stories and to people's woundedness is an incredibly important part of the process of societal healing. Although the TRC was flawed in many, many ways, one thing it did extraordinarily was to demonstrate the power of a society bearing witness to the worst parts of itself, and bearing witness to the deepest wounds that its violence had left. The fourfold path goes on to talk about granting forgiveness as recognizing our shared humanity, and then ultimately renewing or releasing the relationship. And in this question of granting forgiveness, which I find always we spend hours debating and engaging and dialoguing on, and I don't think there's any easy ways of engaging with the question of forgiveness. It's clear in the Archer's perspective that it was a process of releasing oneself from being caught into a continued relationship of harm. But I think that can be complicated, and I think we should treat forgiveness as a site of real work of discomfort. The Arch spoke at one point about forgiveness and reconciliation, and the importance of telling the story as possibly making things worse. So it's not a straight line. It's not a magical process of tell the story and then everything's fine. It might make things worse, and that's part of the process. And so how do we grow the courage? And maybe there's a question back into the room. I don't have many answers. How do we grow the courage of being of bearing witness to, of sharing our own stories and hurts in order, and sitting in the discomfort of that? What kind of leadership can we grow, and how do we grow the courageous leadership that can do that? I also think courageous leadership asks us to expand our relational world. And we speak often about the work being to create circles of courage, that it is very, very difficult to be courageous alone, that courage is sustained in community and in relationship with each other. And so a lot of the work we do is, while we have deep immersive programs, is really throughout our work to try and build in collectives and communities that can draw courage from each other. In practice, this looks like many different things. It can look like virtual meetings of a group of young people. There's a wonderful group who meet every Friday morning. Archbishop Tutu used to do a Eucharist every Friday morning at the St. George's Cathedral. And so there's a group of about 40 people who attended Eucharist with him regularly, who meet every Friday morning on Zoom and share in their own form of a fellowship with each other. And I think more and more we need to overcome isolation and we need to build into community. I think that's where a lot of the magic of courage lies, and how we really are allowed to be fully human, are allowed to waver by knowing that we're in community with others who can hold us up, who can take the stand, and who can continue to support the vision that we have. And then, as I mentioned, in terms of reimagination, I think courageous leadership asks us to imagine into new possibilities. And I won't speak through this slide, but just to say I really value the work of Otto Scharmer at MIT and his theory U, which combines sort of the head, the heart, and the will, and helps us to think about the work of presencing as also being pre-sensing from the emerging future, from the future as it emerges. And I think there is something about the relationship between where we are and that moment of stillness at the bottom of the U that allows us to hear what is already emergent. There's that lovely quote by Arundhati Roy that a new world is possible on a quiet day. I can hear her breathing. So how do we hold that space to hear the new world breathing, and then to really grasp that and build it out into new possibilities and new imaginations? We at the foundation have been on a journey for the last little while into a question of what are the methodologies for societal healing. And in this work, we've drawn on sort of three broad spheres of thinking. The first is work that we've drawn from indigenous communities and deep ecology, which really is about the relational world. Then we've drawn on faith traditions and spirituality, the attentional world, the power of paying attention. And then drawing on sort of the more developmental psychology, the more Western approach to things. And out of these, really tried to identify key questions and processes that come together around a central theme that we think at the heart of healing, we're asking about whether there is love or how we can make love real in a society. So we have developed, as part of that project, a resource which we haven't made public yet, but will be coming, which is really about documenting not a set methodology of facilitating societal healing processes, but sets of questions and tributaries that add into a river of healing. We look at it as the power of recognizing, seeing what is actually happening here, who is actually here, what is the world actually calling for, of recollecting, of collecting who needs to be in the room, how we need to be together, of remembering. There's a very powerful rebuttal I had from one of the participants that it's not about reimagining. That reimagining is almost an indulgent thing. It's about remembering what we already have been as human beings, we have already been in community, in relationship, in these powerful ways. We've spent quite a bit of time thinking about refuge, and a lot of that work drawing on some of the thinking around the hospicing of modernity, Vanessa Andreotti, the sort of image of composting. How do we create the spaces where we can just refuge to allow the time for something to emerge? And then out of refuging, how do we story and how do we generate? How do we use multiple creative methodologies? This is really an emergent journey that has come out of a conversation of 6 practitioners from backgrounds in rites of passage, in indigenous practices, in storytelling, in psychology. But we think that out of these questions, and with a set of tools that are possible, we can embed a sort of approach to the question of healing in work almost anywhere. And that's really what we're trying to get to, is how do we build the consciousness of what helps to heal at a societal level in the work wherever people are. I've jumped around a little bit, but I wanted to end with one of my favorite quotes, and I couldn't get the video to work, but the Arch says it in such a beautiful way. This idea that in front of you is really incontrovertible evidence that the end is going to be beautiful. And for me, I come back to this quote, particularly to nourish my hope, to nurture my hope, particularly in the most challenging times. So I hope that's been of some interest, my sort of meandering meditations on questions of hope and courageous leadership. I'm very happy to be in conversation about them.
Wow, thank you so much, Janet, for that incredible presentation. I think what you've presented has really taken us on the journey of South Africa's continuing healing process, including the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and what it aimed to do, as much as what it did achieve, where we still need to go, but with that understanding of what the objectives were, and what our beloved Archbishop really tried to teach us in bringing about the TRC. I'd like to start to open up for questions and comments. I see there's quite a few in the chat, as well as round of applause. I'm just going to go up to the top one. I had seen that Dr. Precious Simba, who was quite instrumental in securing our speaker today, she had posed a question. So Doc, perhaps you'd like to unmute and pose your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being privileged. What an amazing talk. Without taking too much time, thank you, Janet, for that. And once again, chills. And very profound points that are raised, especially in this time that we find ourselves in. My question was around it has become almost like a culture of cynicism around humanitarian catastrophes, obviously fueled by social media. How do we get around that? Or is that even a question? Maybe it's an all person's view that we need to take these matters seriously. Perhaps the cynicism is the new way to look at what we are experiencing as humanity. But how do we navigate that?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question. In many ways, I think we're all challenged by the presence of information and heart-shattering realities every day. To spend the last 2 years watching a genocide unfold in Palestine does something to our humanity. And I think almost in the context of the numbing that social media can do, in the context of sort of, as you say, the cynicism, the, what do they call it, the manosphere, the broligarchy, the sort of cynicism about what is good in the society. I think it probably asks of us to be louder and more powerful in our not defense of hope, but our championing of the possibility that something can change. If we give up, well, then there's no alternative. There must be a way through. There must be a way towards what the arch would call seeing the light even in the darkness. And I go back to watching his speeches, the height of apartheid, where there's no, in the 1970s, the 80s that were so violent, where there's no sense of imminent change. The apartheid government is conscripting young white men and putting them onto the streets of townships with guns. And yet, even then, to imagine, there's a lovely, I mentioned it in a newsletter recently, at the end of this march where the arch calls us the Rainbow People, the police sort of harass the crowd and there's some violence and people become very disheartened. And so they return to the cathedral. And he speaks about the fact that we can't allow ourselves to be discouraged because freedom is so close. And he draws this picture of the white policemen who've been beating up the protesters being free in a society where they can just sit and watch the rugby and feel proud of their country. And we can do that now. And we can do that because we've walked a very long journey and we've got an incredible coach and an incredible captain. But there's something so powerful to me in reading this speech from the 1980s, where what is imagined as freedom is a white person feeling free in a society and watching the rugby and feeling proud and not ashamed of the country that they live in. So I'm just meandering. I don't know if I've got the answer, but I think the times, there's this lovely quote, the times are urgent, let us slow down. The times are urgent, let us be more present, let us be more hopeful, let us be even deeper in our conviction that there is a possibility beyond the extraordinary suffering and the brutality. I think, the extraordinary brutality of these times. I wanted to maybe just say, I saw one question on the chat about whether we'd worked with corporates, and I thought I'd just pick up on that because we actually have, and it's been very, very interesting, particularly working with them about race in the South African context. And maybe to paint a picture of post-apartheid South Africa, we have something called the Reconciliation Barometer that comes out every 2 years. And it almost tracks the integratedness of our society or not. And so what it's shown, the 2023 version came out, and what it showed was that almost all South Africans have interacted with someone of another race, but only about 30% of us socialize with people of other races. And so even though we've integrated in many ways our society, our intimate worlds remain quite segregated. And the workplace is the one place where that is different. It's the one place where you are in relationship with the entire diversity of the country. And so we've been walking a journey with one corporate around building their capacity to have courageous conversations about race and bringing this thinking into that work. And at the heart of it is the humanizing work. I think we underestimate the power of humanizing work, and that humanizing work can be quite simple. We're currently hosting, if anyone's in Cape Town, a beautiful exhibition of children's art, which is artworks that show that was South Korean children drawing portraits of themselves and writing notes to North Korean children, and North Korean children drawing portraits of themselves and sending notes to South Korean children. And it's a simple act of humanization, but in a context in which you are taught to hate, even not being able to meet in person, even just imagining the humanity of the person you are telling your story to, becomes a radical act of connection. And so holding space for storytelling, for the complexity of our humanity, rather than the dogma of a particular narrative, is really important. Which is not to say, and this is something I struggle to do, and think was a powerful example of the Arch, is the ability to speak truth to power forthrightly and with conviction, to call out injustice, and at the same time to hold the humanity of everyone, including the perpetrator, as sacred. And that is quite an ask, but is something extraordinary, that allows us to open new ways and new pathways to finding each other in society. So I thought I'd just add that on, having noticed that one question.
Thank you. Thank you, Janet. Dr. Simba, I'm not sure if you want to take over.
Yeah, I just noticed that there was another, in the 4 minutes that we have left, there were two questions. One from Farana, who is just saying that the issues covered are quite important, and you'd love to read more research. Let me just, says, I have found trust plays an important role in delaying the process of healing, loving, and having the courage to start over due to the past trauma or unpleasant experiences. Have your experiences, or in your experience, found anything, or in your research? I think the question is around trust. If you don't mind, can I pair that question with another one? The other question is Fazela, who's saying, how do we tackle the lack of humanity in response to the situation in Sudan, in Palestine, indigenous communities facing neglect and commitments? So those questions, maybe as we round up.
No easy ones then.
I'm sorry.
I think trust is a fundamentally important piece of the puzzle, and particularly in our ability to build relational worlds between us. You know, one of the failures of the TRC, or the failures of government to follow through on the TRC's recommendations, is that it created massive distrust of the process of reconciliation. And so there is something profoundly important about the follow through in doing any kind of social change work. The follow through matters, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not the perfectly right thing. And I've found, as you say, this is this work of self-repair for societal repair. People with deep trauma, that trauma plays out. I often think, if you're walking around South African society, any man in his mid-50s and above, any white man in his mid-50s and above, probably was conscripted, probably held a gun and aimed it at Black people in the service of an idea of a society of supremacy. But they're walking around our society, mid-50s and above. Most of our politicians were tortured, spent time in detention, were facing extremely challenging times in exile. And I think we can forget their humanity and the depth of what they've experienced. And so a lot of what I guess I'm calling for is to humanize all of us, to really come to know ourselves and know each other in the depth of our humanity, so that we can really work with all the mess that is, and everything that it comes with. I am also broken by the lack of humanity, both of global conflict at the moment, and maybe it's just the sort of particular context I'm in, acts such as the cutting of all USAID funding, leaving probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children to starve, or hundreds of thousands of people to die of HIV. And I think, again, coming back to it, I think it's because we dehumanize. I think it's because for an administrator sitting in an office in Washington, those children are not real children. And so a lot of our work is to make ourselves more and more human, to make everybody more and more connected to the humanity of everybody. And so that takes sort of really powerful rehumanizing work. And I think we don't do enough of that rehumanizing work in trying to build, sort of, in trying to address conflict. The South African negotiation period from when Mandela was released in 1990 to when we had elections in 1994 is often spoken about as a miracle. But it was a very dark time. More people were killed in political violence between 1990 and 1994 than at any other time in our history. So even while the most hopeful thing was happening, these negotiations, the worst of ourselves was present. And in the negotiations, what ultimately seemed to cause the breakthroughs was simply that they spent so much time together. And so Cyril Ramaphosa found out that Rolf Meyer loves trout fishing, and so does he. And suddenly there were two men who love fishing and no longer the enemy. And so that, for me, is why the commitment to the keeping on trying to find each other is so important, because if we can keep on being in each other's presence and committing to, however hard it might be, however hurt we might feel, I think that's where the power lies for something transformational to emerge. And acknowledging, I think it would be inhuman of us to not feel broken by the inhumanity in the world at the moment.
Thank you. I think oftentimes when we meet online, we are not able to capture some of these Selah moments where we just pause and take all of that in. But I think I could feel quite a lot of that in the audience today. Thank you, Janet, for that. This was a talk that was well worth the wait. And I think the content resonates with us. I think when we started this journey to planning this, we did not think that the world would change so much in such a very short space of time, and how necessary it is to even talk about hope in such a time. Thank you so much. A lot of the comments are just speaking to just how revitalized people are, how they're feeling a sense of hope again, because I think what this situation really does, especially for practitioners, a lot of the people in our community, they're practitioners. Some have been working on DEI programs that were shut down. Some are in NGOs leading programs with funding that has been cut off. So this has been a really demoralizing time. And then in all of that, we are in a pool, we're witnessing, like I said, a genocide in real time. So, and not just one, not just two, and that is the wonder of this time that we live in. And so for a lot of the people in the chats, they're just reiterating how much they needed to hear this, to hear the words of the Arch and his work, and the idea of hope. If I can recollect to our very first meeting, without taking too much more time, you spoke of hope as a messy business, as gritty, as even dirty, but hope as necessary. And I think we're finding ourselves in that time. And thank you so much for sparing your time in a very busy schedule to come and speak to our community and share words that I think our community, which most of us are practitioners, really needed to hear. And we hope we're going to carry all of this with us into our communities as well. As we round off, friends, colleagues, thank you so much for bearing with us. We're 5 minutes over time, and I'm so sorry for that. Just quick reminders, I think you've seen them in the chats for the upcoming conference. In our next webinar with George Mutalewa, that's going to be fantastic. It's coming from a global peace network, and I think he is going to have so much to give for our community. So thank you, everybody, and thank you for being with us. Verna, I don't think I've left anything out.
No, thank you very much, Precious. I think, Janet, we'll have to share the chat with you because people are really appreciating the talk and your way of talking and your way of presenting and just making something complex so simple. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. And Janet did say that she should be able to make it next week, Wednesday, at 3 o'clock for us. And I've posted multiple times in the chat the registration link for that. So please, I know there might be some more questions that were not answered. What I generally do is I go through the chat and I pull out those questions and we can discuss those questions further. But next week, Wednesday, if you can make it, it's not another presentation. It's completely just an open discussion and also a great opportunity to hear from the floor and to hear from people. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And Janet, really thank you very much for your time. And I'm so glad that we could delay for a week. I know many people will be watching the recording afterwards because I got many people emailing me that they couldn't make this week, but they couldn't make last week. So for the over 200 other people that will watch the recording later, I hope you all enjoyed it also. And Janet, I don't know if you want to, you can put your email address in chat if you want to, or just the link to your website, just so people have that too. And then we can share that with everyone. Well, thank you very much, everybody. There we go, Janet at tutu.org.za for those online that don't see the chat. Janet at tutu.org.za, and the website is www.tutu.org.za. So that wraps up it for today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of the day, afternoon, evening, morning, for wherever you are in the world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.